Welcome to another edition of Politics Done Right. My name is Egberto Willis, your host. We're here with Dr. James McCann, Professor of Political Science at Purdue University, and Dr. Michael Jones Correa, Professor of Political Science at UPenn. Men, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look, one of the issues that's been out there in the ethos is that the Latino vote has been taken for granted for a long time. And that has a lot to do with maybe the Latino vote not showing up at the polls. Now, here comes Donald Trump, and Donald Trump completely disparages the community. As I understand, James, you have some thoughts on that and what the effect it will actually have on the voting performance of Latinos this cycle. What's your thoughts?
Well, we both have some thoughts, Gilberto, but I can jump in and say that, with the Latino vote based on current polling, maybe about a quarter to 30% might be somewhat favorably disposed towards Trump. So the bulk of the population is certainly not very supportive of Trump. The big question, as you suggest, is voter turnout. What we picked up on in our surveys is a fair amount of engagement, and other people have mentioned that as well. So that would bode well for pretty good turnout this November. Michael, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, no, our book, which just came out, Holding Fast, makes an argument that Latino immigrants reacted to Trump's candidacy and election in 2016 by not going underground, but rather by becoming more engaged, more civically engaged on a number of measures, even as they were increasingly unhappy with the direction of the country and the direction things were taking. But they became more active in a number of different ways by everything from joining meetings to attending protests. And so that bodes well for their engagement in 2020. And you already saw signs of this in 2018.
Now, Dr. Manuel Pastor is under the belief right now that while much of that may be true, that the Biden campaign has probably neglected quite a bit the Latino population. Now, look, I am both Black and Latino, and I can tell you that on the Black side, I see a lot of engagement from Biden in these different communities. And I must say that I've also noticed not as much in front of the Latino community. In fact, he had a faux pas when he said, Black folks are a bit more unified or in concert than Latinos. So I understood what he meant, because after all, the Latino community is very vast. Do you think that he is missing something that by not being able to engage these communities where they are? Florida, we have Cubanos. In the Southwest, we have mostly Mexicans. In the I-95 corridor, we have a lot of Puerto Ricanos. What are your thoughts, Michael?
So I don't think that he's wrong necessarily. I think that the Biden campaign was slow getting off the mark. So, keep in mind that Biden really didn't have much of a campaign structure, I will say.
True.
Even as he was winning the nomination, and his campaign has come together really toward the end of this cycle, and a lot of money coming in, and that's important because he is now beginning to spend that money. And so I'm now beginning to hear about regional Latino directors, state directors. So there are now people being hired on the ground. There is now more outreach on the ground, but it's also clear to me that this is playing a catch-up game, and he is sort of behind where you would expect.
Now, James, don't you think a lot of that has to do with, I was talking to a few candidates here in Houston, and I was really upset with a lot of the ads that they had out there, because I believe they don't go for the jugular the way, let's say, Republicans would. Now, that said, I think part of the problem as well is that these campaigns work with a lot of, and I'm not going to call you guys see how things work, but a lot of people in these universities don't know what's happening in the barrios. They don't know what's happening in Appalachia. They don't know what's happening in the ghettos. So, and generally speaking, they don't put the monies in those communities and the leaders in those communities. Do you think that both of these campaigns in this case, James, or do you think they're doing the right thing as far as how they're dispersing these?
Yeah, no, I mean, to echo a point that Michael made a minute ago, Biden is playing catch up. Right now, though, he's pretty well flush with cash, and so in the home stretch, there's going to be more and more investment. But yeah, the kinds of places you're mentioning, yeah, they have been undermobilized, and that's a sort of historic story. It's not just with Biden, but traditionally we could fault the American party system. Actually, in our polling, we found that Latino immigrants tend to tilt towards the Democrats, and that's not exactly front page news, but the partisanship tends to be rather thin. And I think a lot of that has to do with the choices that the party makes, from election cycle to election cycle.
Well, go ahead,
Jump in there a
Dr.
little bit to say that, parties historically, as Jay was mentioning, have reached out to people who are already engaged. So if you voted before, then they contact you. But if you're a new voter and part of a new electorate, immigrant voters, young voters, voters who haven't historically voted in the past, or kind of weak partisans, as Jay was mentioning, then parties are much less likely to reach out to you. And this has meant a kind of historic disinvestment in the Latino community and the immigrant community more broadly. The parties, both parties, not just Biden, have not done outreach to these new voters.
Yeah, let me tell you, if I could
go
check,
ahead, please.
Yeah. One additional thing to add to that is that the political parties, I think, could be faulted for playing such a short game, right? That they sort of come alive during campaigns to serve the immediate needs of the candidates. And it's sort of, once the election is over, poof, okay, the parties sort of go completely dormant. So it would help them, I believe, if they played a somewhat longer game and cultivated these emerging constituencies.
That's prescient. I mean, that is an absolute fact. Now, I tell you what's interesting, though, right? You can take that exactly and move it on to what's occurring today. Pennsylvania, Florida. We all know that we have to bring a whole lot of people into the fold, as both of you have just explained. We look at Pennsylvania, we see in the case of Republicans, they have a huge advantage in new registrations since April. We look at Florida, we have the same thing. Donald Trump played an interesting game. There are not a lot of voters that are, I shouldn't say a lot that are Republican, but they know how to go ahead and hunt them. And part of doing that is exactly what you're talking about, and that is identifying those people. And I've started to, I don't know about Republicans in general, but I can tell you about the Trump campaign in particular that is actually hunting people. And if you take a look at what they've done, it seems like they've done that. But we want to talk about your book, Holding Fast, Resilience and Civic Engagement Among Latino Immigrants. Who wants to tell me the tenet of the book in the first place?
All right. Well, Michael gave a very nice thumbnail sketch a few minutes ago, so I'm going to amplify on that. The sort of dominant storyline is that Latino immigrants following the 2016 election exhibited, as one might expect, an awful lot of anxiety about what's coming next and a great deal of disappointment. That was sort of a dominant thread in media coverage following the 2016 election. So we measure that through surveys, okay? But we also find a fair amount of anger, understandable anger. And so the sort of mixture of disappointment, anxiety, and anger, that mixture it's all a sort of powerful driver of political engagement. So the big question is, given these reactions, will you go underground and sort of go into duck and cover mode and even reconsider whether you want to remain in the US over the long run? Or is there resilience? Is there constructive pushback? And we find much more evidence for the latter. We find that the immigrants in our study expressed a deep loss of faith in government institutions under Trump, but at the same time, they did not lose faith in America on the whole. There's just as much trust in other Americans, just as much patriotism. There's no deeper desire to, kind of leave the country and return to the country of birth. And there is a considerable amount of engagement in real political activities, all the way from protest activities to everyday kind of pedestrian sorts of activities, like going to school board meetings and things like that. So we
No,
take that as a good sign of kind of the ongoing incorporation of immigrants into US democracy.
now, were we talking just documented immigrants or undocumented immigrants as well?
Everybody.
Mm.
Our sample has, so these are all first generation immigrants, people who have migrated to the US themselves. So it includes people who have naturalized, people who are legal permanent residents or green card holders, and undocumented residents as well. For all of these groups, we found that the patterns of holding fast, remaining engaged, remains true even if people were undocumented. People who are citizens are engaged at higher levels than the undocumented, but everyone stays engaged.
You know what was interesting? I went to Arizona. Was it Arizona? I'm sorry, I went to Nevada to work the polls with Bernie Sanders, and I stood outside of different Latino supermarkets, and what we found most amazing was that most of these Latinos that were coming out were not engaged in the body politic, but when we made the case to them, they immediately wanted to vote. They felt like, oh, you mean I can actually have control? And it wasn't like sitting in front of a Safeway or something. This was a Latino market, and they were ready to talk, and they would tell you stories, and that's a feeling that I got. Did you capture did you capture that kind of Latin community, or did you capture, let's say, the Latin community that was already integrated into the US?
Yeah, well, we tried to capture as comprehensively as possible the entire Latino immigrant community. And so we have, many people in the sample have lived in the United States for decades, okay? But we also have some relative newcomers in the sample. And that was an important thing that we wanted to investigate. How do these two different kinds of groups vary in terms of the reactions? And one of the things we found is that they don't vary a whole lot, right?
Right.
It's a sort of one size fits all kind of framework that we have here in the book, that even immigrants who are rather well established in the United States still felt as much kind of disappointment and anger and anxiety about where politics was going, and they were just as sort of engaged because of that.
Now, one of the things that people are worried about when it comes to voting, et cetera, is that a lot of Latino households are mixed. In other words, they may have an undocumented person within that household. And because they want to attract the least attention, have you found that that could possibly affect whether they vote or not, whether they participate in the census or not?
Yeah, so this is what social scientists call mixed status households, which
Right.
is a fancy way of saying what you're saying. And so one of the interesting things we found was that not only were people feeling a sense of threat and anxiety for themselves, but they were feeling a sense of threat and anxiety for their people who were close to them, friends, families, loved ones. And if when we asked them, are you fearful or afraid of the possibility that someone close to you will be deported? People who felt that fear for people close to them were also more likely to be civically engaged. So there was a link between the sense of threat for people who they loved and their willingness to become active in civic life in the United States. So to answer your question, even if you're a citizen, even if you were U.S. born, we speculate that that sense of anxiety and fear for people close to you will engage people in American politics.
Now, in your analysis, did you break down? Did you do the breakdown based on Biden's confusion? In other words, that Latinos are so diverse and may also have diverse attitudes towards politics.
Yeah, in our analysis, we do pick up on a lot of the diversity with respect to partisanship. We compare and contrast, Mexicans who were uniquely singled out in so many ways versus non-Mexicans to see if there are any differences there. And actually, we find relatively few differences. That's another interesting finding between Mexicans and non-Mexicans in terms of their sort of fearfulness of politics, the anger that is expressed, the disappointment in the country. So as I say, to hark back to what was mentioned a few minutes ago, it's a sort of almost one size fits all, or it's a very encompassing kind of conclusion that we have, that Latinos across the board tended as a group to really react negatively the way we pick up on, and to kind of demonstrate in response that resilience and engagement.
Well, I really like the title of the book, Resilience and Civic Engagement. That is sort of what we promote here. That is what we are into. Now, to end this, what I'd like, for you to do is tell me something that I didn't ask that you wanted me to ask about, not only your book, but about what's happening right now in our politics.
Well, one thing that Jay mentioned, which I'd like to pick up on, is the story where we found is a national story, and that we thought there might be more differences, say, between residents living in California and residents living in, say, states like Arizona. So California has a reputation for being a very welcoming state for immigrants, and Arizona a very unwelcoming state. And what we actually found is there are remarkably, again, few differences. So if you're an immigrant living in Arizona or California, you react much in the same way to Trump's election and Trump's presidency. You feel threatened and you're resilient. And this is kind of interesting. And to think about that, there's a nationalization of politics taking place, which is true for immigrants as it is for many other Americans.
James?
Boy, what to add to that? Yeah, that's. Let me say that. To maybe expand on the thinness of Democratic partisanship. Okay, what we found in the book is that while immigrants who have a party affiliation will say that they're Democrats by a ratio of, say, maybe 4 or 5 to 1, there still is an awful lot of uncertainty out there about the political parties. When we ask questions about which party best represents the interests of Latinos or immigrants in general, or women and children and business owners, the typical response is often a shoulder shrug. They're not really sure. Okay, so let me just say, to amplify on what we mentioned before, I think the political parties really need to work a bit harder, right, to reach out to these new constituents.
That's a very good point and a good place to end. Dr. James McCann, Professor of Political Science at Purdue University, and Dr. Michael Jones Correa, Professor of Political Science at UPenn, authors of Holding Fast, Resilience and Civic Engagement Among Latino Immigrants. We'll have the book posted at the website as well as on the lead. Thank you so kindly for having been here with Politics Done Right.
Well, thank you very much.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number 1, subscribe to our channel, and number 2, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.